This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Catherine, Robert, and I are going to talk about character agency. And Robert, I have a feeling you are eager to get us started on this question. So,
Well, yeah, as Catherine said pre-show, I tend to have pet peeves about it. But I think, it's worth deconstructing as to what agency really is and how we use it as writers, because, we're not necessarily always aware. And, does it mean that our character always has to advance the story? Does it mean that they always have to be the one doing something? What happens if they're not? Does that mean I've lost agency? What are the different aspects of agency? I mean, it's kind of one of those things where we band it around as your character must have agency, and it's a bit of one of those, it's an editor thing. But as us writers, channeling the latest horror story and wondering how to end the chapter. Oh, did I end up with agency or not? I don't know. So I think it's just maybe start with a bit of a what is it? And if we could go into sort of how to use it, and obviously some examples of where it's poorly done or not done.
Right. Well, first it is that it's, there is that commandment, thou shalt have agency in thy novel, right? But I like what you're saying, because it is getting at a much more nuanced concern of ours as writers. Is it an absolute? Is it an always in every moment? And so the fuller answer is no. That would become ridiculous if our protagonist always did everything himself and never had support from those supporting characters, or nothing ever happened to him. So we can't view it with such a narrow lens. But overall, our protagonist must have agency. So it's like when we talk about rising stakes and tension, I like to say that if you graph it on Freytag's pyramid on that arc, if you are zoomed out and you look at that arc, you're going to have that nice rising line that looks like a straight line from your bottom left to your top right of your plot arc. But if you zoom in, it's going to look more like one of those stock graphs where you go up and down and things bounce around a little bit. And we can think of agency in the same way. If you zoom out and look at your story overall, your protagonist must have agency that advances the story from start to finish. But if you come in and you're looking at individual scenes or chapters at various plot points, there are, of course, things that must happen to the protagonist. And there are supporting characters and subplots, and they can't all be lame ducks just because our protagonist has agency. So we need a much more complex, nuanced view. And of course, when we look at our characters' flaws, and especially that fatal flaw, sometimes our protagonist needs to be weak or incapacitated in some way, either physically or emotionally, in order to create that character arc, those hurdles that the protagonist has to overcome through the plot journey in order to successfully create the character arc.
Okay, so can I just step back a bit then? When you're first talking about the global story, and you're saying that your main character must have the agency to take the story from start to finish. What do you mean by that? So what is the agency? And also, maybe a question for a bit later in the show, where you've talked about a fatal flaw or issues that the character has. I guess they can have agency that's going to advance the story, but in a bad way, in the sense that their agency may be incorrectly directed, if I understand that correctly.
Right.
So if you could just back up a bit, what does it mean? I mean, can I have a story where a character has no agency, for example? And it sounds like no, because otherwise that flatline.
Right, exactly. So agency means that your protagonist makes choices. Your protagonist acts and reacts, chooses consciously to do things throughout the story that advance your plot and draw the reader through that story. So if your character does not have agency, things happen to and around him. He's buffeted by the current, So we don't want a character who doesn't have a hand in his own fate. It's not a Greek tragedy where the gods decide everything and the character is just sort of going from one crisis to another until, he plucks out his eyes or something. So at its most basic, that's what agency is.
Okay.
Giving your protagonist the will and the power to have a hand in his own fate, to choose how he acts and reacts to things. Now, of course, he might fly off the handle. He may react without thinking sometimes. But, if you drill down deep enough, even those kinds of reactions can be your character's own doing. So perhaps not choice in the sense of consciously and rationally thinking it through, but it's on his shoulders. He did it, right? And that advanced the story. So that's what agency is. What was that?
Right.
Does that answer that piece of the question?
Yes. So yeah, it does. So let's say you've got a group of characters, I don't know, maybe they're on a ship at sea and they're sitting around the cabin and discussing, what course to take. Then if the main character had the answer always supplied by one of the other characters and simply went along with it, that would be a lack of agency. But if one of the other characters proposed an idea and the main character debated it and threw it back and then made the decision to still go with that choice, then that would be the same scene but with the main character having agency within it as opposed to it passively happening.
Right. Yes. I mean, basically, yes. But you also need to look at what is the theme? What is the character's flaw? Perhaps your character needs to learn to stand up for himself. So in the scene you're writing, the leader is badgering others into a bad decision. And so in that scene, our protagonist, is resentful but passive and goes along, but you're building tension up to the moment when the protagonist is forced to overcome his reticence and conflict avoidance and act against that leader character, the mean guy.
So in micro context, you'd say, yes, that's true, they didn't have agency in that moment, but it might be that you considered that in the overall scene or the overall theme and that it was okay. So that's part of your stock graph ups and downs.
Right.
Where at that point, they didn't have agency at that point, but it was deliberate for the story.
Right. And also, you can look at it on another level and say this character didn't have action, physical agency. He didn't speak out or do something, but there was emotional agency because we were in that point of view and we saw the turmoil brewing within. We saw the discomfort and the tension mounting, and we felt that, and it compelled us to keep reading to see how these emotions were going to erupt in action. So that's sort of a much more subtle way to address the agency question and to remind us as writers not to always look at agency as doing something physical. Just like we can't always look at thrilling action as explosions. It depends on the story you're writing.
Yeah, because, for example, in Story Grid, Sean Coyne talks about where plot turns happen on, say, action or revelation. So that kind of speaks to what you were just talking about there, where the character might do something or something physical might happen to the character, but also there can be revelation where it could be an internal revelation, although usually that's not considered to be a revelation as such. Normally in Story Grid they consider a revelation to be when the character learns something new, and that's rarely about themselves because that can be a bit too literary. But can be the case. And then the other way of looking at it is whether your scene action moves along with it by causation or coincidence. So coincidence might be I go to the supermarket and I bump into somebody I haven't seen for 5 years. And that causes me to act in a particular way. Right. Or I go into the supermarket and I make a decision that I'm going to shoplift, in which case I've caused the action that's going to happen. Right. So either of which are interesting ways to look at, I suppose, that agency question, especially when you go back to that situation that I proposed, where you've got a group of characters sitting around a ship's cabin trying to navigate. You can look at it any number of different ways. So it sounds like it's a good tool to not necessarily get caught up with when you're drafting, but when you're going back and if there's something not flowing right within the story, you can think, okay, maybe I left out, maybe that I've had 5 scenes in a row where my main characters had little or no agency. That's why it feels like it drags.
Right, and yeah, you should definitely go in and look at it on the scene and chapter level, but it's useful also before you enter a revision draft to step back and look at the entire line of that arc and say, what are the major events of the story? How do they come about? And is my protagonist choosing things that advance the story, that either cause or respond to these events in a way that's compelling, that's interesting, that's exciting, that's dramatic or comedic, that keeps the reader moving forward through that story. And if overall the answer is no, then you need to go back and revise and say, how can my character face choices here? It can't just be this thing happened and then this thing happened and then this thing happened. It's got to be, my character was confronted with the situation. My character made a choice to act, and then that led to the next thing.
Okay.
Can you delve deeper into what that difference between my character is reacting to a situation versus my character is causing or acting to the situation? Do you understand? Do you get what I'm saying? Like, it sort of feels like semantics sometimes when I'm looking at it on my own writing. I'm like, I could frame it to where I feel like my character is acting. So what's the difference between reacting and acting?
So, okay, I'm going to go back to the example of the current book I'm working on, the Scott Hall books, that's fresh in my mind. And because I actually did do some journaling about Jess's agency not too long ago, one of the things I need her to do on her character arc is I need her to move through this PTSD and start getting her life in shape. And she's got a friend who's also a cop who intervenes and forces her to go to a support group, and that doesn't work out. And then he says, all right, you're going to go to a self-defense class, take it or leave it. And that's fine. He's there to fulfill this role of introducing these opportunities to Jess. But if Jess just says, okay, and she goes, okay, yeah, I'll go to the self-defense class, then that's a very sort of passive, agreeable way to move her through the story. And it's not interesting. So I had to ask myself, what is motivating Jess to agree to these opportunities? And what is forcing her, or what is forcing change here? It's got to be her. It can't all be external. So she's been screwing up in her life, and she had a meeting with an editor about a book deal. She had to ask for an extension. She got the extension, but it was conditional. It's her last chance. If she screws up again, she'll never be published, kind of a deal. So that is motivating her to try to get her life in order, right? So she's got to react to two different situations and make the choice that makes sense for her and helps her move the story forward. There's a ghost story. It's what the book's about. She has to choose to interact with the ghost, or I don't have my book, right? So she's resisting that because of the past book, her issues, the PTSD. So it's not enough that other people want her to interact with the ghost. She's got to come up against the situation in a way that it makes sense for her to choose it for herself and not just be agreeable with circumstances or with what other people want. Does that make sense? Does that help?
Yeah. Turning it personal again, personal and individual.
Yeah, and making it make sense with the motivation, with the character's motivation, and not external circumstances or what others want. she can't do it to make Victor happy. She's got to do it because she is driven to.
Right.
Yeah, it comes down to those small events as well. I remember writing my first novel, and when it was in draft form, getting feedback that either things happened too easily or they didn't make sense. And I think part of other issues aside about how the conflict was designed in the plot, I think some of it was just characters going along with one another too easily. And I guess agency is one tool for looking at that. Is you can say, well, what are they driven to do? What issues are they facing? What's the theme of the story? What's the main character's goal in this particular scene? And, would they just simply accept in that way? And if they do, is that part of where I'm going with the overall question of agency for that character? So it's quite nested, isn't it? It's, it's not straightforward as in one particular beat, oh, my character didn't make the choice, therefore I've screwed up agency. It's much more both global and down to the micro and how they fit together in the jigsaw.
It is, absolutely. And I like that word you used, Robert, the nested. It is very nested. And, talking about characters being too agreeable with each other, that connects to our nicey nice episode. And, if you write a scene in which character A proposes something and character B agrees to it, that's not a very interesting scene. You need to have something else happening in that scene, or you need to make that outcome less agreeable so that there's story there. What we want in real life is everybody getting along and everybody cooperates. That's not the stuff of great fiction.
No, I mean, you think of some of those internet memes, the whole one does not simply walk into Mordor, and how much has that been reused, and it's just one interaction where, one character disagreed and said, you can't do that. And, of course, Frodo and Sam said, nope, we're doing it anyway. So, it's pretty interesting how it can turn an entire plot based on one choice a character makes, of course, to me, those are the thrilling moments as well, when agency lines up with conflict and a spectacular plot reveal or a twist or something. That, to me, is where a story becomes very special.
And that's our goal.
Well, that's right. And this comes down to my pet peeves, is when things just drop into the protagonist's lap for them to then make a choice. And so to me, that although there might be sort of a superficial agency, it's too convenient. That was one of my big bugbears about story. I love stories where, and I don't mean it always has to be really tough for them, there's that thing where, you make them climb up a tree and make it hard for them to get down, then you set fire to the tree, all that sort of thing. Yes, they've got to have that struggle. But it's when things just conveniently turn up, somebody delivered this letter for you, and this explains how Aunt Maud hid a secret diary in the back of the chimney. I better go and find that. It's, please, without any clues to that, then you kind of lose faith in the character's agency anyway, because you just think, it's just going to happen at some point.
Right. That feels much more like plot driving your character. Like you've plotted the plot points, and then your character follows your plot points rather than your character
driving the plot.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think agency is key to the character driving the plot instead of the plot driving the character. It's that
way to think about
being buffeted by the current idea of the plot is driving the character. Things keep happening to and around the character, but we need that agency, that engagement with the plot. So, it's action, reaction, choice, consequence. Those are the main pairings. And we need to see those play out actively throughout the story, throughout the character's journey through the plot.
That's a great clue, actually, I think, for people writing action-based fiction. Whether it is, high-speed car chase action or science fiction action or fantasy action, we can get very caught up in the action itself, and forget that there still has to be buried within that the character choices that drive the action, and it's not all about the shock and awe of the explosions.
Right.
And it can be quite intimate, in fact, some of the action, and very character driven. And not that you want to slow down a fight to the point where all of a sudden you spend half a page with the character reflecting on something that happened to them in their childhood, how it's causing them to be a little bit wary of shooting the gun. Because you don't want to slow things down necessarily at the wrong moment. But definitely, I like the idea that action isn't there just for action's sake. And I think I've been guilty of doing that. Think, I need a car chase here, or something similar, and because it's one of the obligatory scenes. I've got to have that, it's a convention.
Right.
The genre are going to expect it. And then if you do it without driving it from the character's point of view, it becomes, as you say, then plot driven.
Yeah, and that is key. In theater, there's the joke line, but what's my motivation? And it's handy for us as writers to keep saying, but what's my protagonist's motivation? What is the point of view character's reason for choosing this action over any other, for continuing to engage throughout the story?
So as an editor then, and if you were looking developmentally at somebody's work, would that be the lens that you'd view it? Okay, what's their motivation here in order to divine whether there's an agency issue? Would that be a sort of clue? Or are you don't understand the motivation, I suppose? Yeah.
Motivation is definitely a clue. I would ask a writer anytime a character's motivation becomes muddy and unclear, anytime I start thinking, why is this character here? Why is this character making this choice? Yep. That's a big motivation issue. The other thing with agency, a good example comes in multiple point of view stories where you've got two or more point of view characters in a scene, especially an action scene, and the author has picked the point of view character who does not have the most at stake in that scene. And so you lose a lot of the power potential in that scene. So the one who's got the most invested in the outcome of that movement in your story, that's the one we need to be working with. So if you say you've got a single point of view story and your character's entering a big action scene or a big high stakes scene, doesn't have to be action, ask, what are the stakes? What does this character stand to gain or lose through the outcome of the scene? Okay, why is the character investing in this? What is the choice being made here? It's not just happening to him. He's an actor, a doer, not just a beer exister, sitter, right? Yeah. And if you don't have a clear answer to that question of stakes and motivation and that nesting and how it fits, then you probably have an agency issue.
Right.
Right.
Okay. Makes sense.
Good. I'm glad that makes sense. Yeah.
And then, my biggest pet peeve is the thing, when you get to the climactic moment of a novel and the character, the plot is solved, but not by the means of the character's agency at all.
Right.
Whether it's Deus Ex Machina or whether it's just a lame ending. So that's to me where I would pick up on it the most, and I would say, "Oh, there's an agency problem right there."
Right, and that happens a lot when supporting characters are too big for their britches. So you can have a supporting character rescue your hero once or twice over the course of the plot, but never at the climax. That just cuts your hero off at the knees, removes all agency. So you might think it's very exciting and dramatic to have the villain tie the hero to the train tracks, but then who's going to rescue the hero? If it's not the hero, you've destroyed your climax. You can't have the sidekick swoop in and get the hero off the tracks. It's got to be the hero's own agency, because you establish throughout the course of your book a protagonist and an antagonist. You've built that tension through all the plot events rising up toward the climax must be the face-off between the protagonist and the antagonist. And supporting characters can be there to support, but their role really needs to be limited to certain elements, depends on your story. What those elements will be. Never let a supporting character handicap your protagonist in your climax.
Right.
Or save your protagonist, right?
Yeah, they're just there to grease the wheels, aren't they? They're, it's not to actually drive the thing forward. And that's a tricky one, like you say, with your hero tied to the train tracks, because in reality, a lot of heroes in stories are going to be victims for most of the story because they're at the mercy of the antagonist. So it's a key skill of writing to be able to have the main character have sufficient agency to free themselves from their victimhood and to become the hero that the story demands that they be.
Right.
And when we say hero, we don't necessarily mean Superman's type hero. Right. We just mean that they defeat the exactly. And I think that's definitely quite tricky. And whenever we've written ourselves into corners, I'm sure it's because you've written the hero so far into victimhood. You go, oh my God, now he or she is literally strapped to the train tracks and the train's coming. I've got no idea what to do.
Right. Well, and
I'll just have someone come in and save them. And nope, can't
do that. No, and it creates an issue as writers where you have to sort of escape what would be real and reasonable and logical in order to maintain the parameters of the protagonist-antagonist face-off. You need them in that ring, and you can't have other people interfering or refereeing during the big match. So, the cavalry cannot come in until the fight's over. They just can't. And, I've mixed at least 3 metaphors here, but so be it.
Yes, well, I mean, if I come back to Lord of the Rings again, I've said this before, and it's generally well debated at the very end there that, it may be it's Sam and Gollum that really affect the climax. But if you look at the overall theme, Frodo's a victim to the ring and ultimately to Sauron. So, he has had to defeat that increasing power more and more and more as they get to the mountain. And if it wasn't for his desperation that he was going to do it or die, even though he needs the help of his colleagues right at the end, I suppose that speaks to the theme of fellowship. That whole idea that it's going to take all of us to come together. But he's still clearly the main hero, battling as also the main victim of the evil.
Yes. And you can certainly have a team ending, but you need to maintain the protagonist at the top of your pyramid. So that is the team leader, the most active, the one with the most agency, the most choice, the highest stakes.
Well, I think you also have to argue if they weren't there, could the scene still proceed in the way could the story still resolve? And if it can, then there's a mistake in the scene. The hero has to be the pivot, the main pivot, the pivotal climax scene, in my opinion.
Yeah, exactly. So if you've got a team of characters and one has, mad computer skills and one has mad judo skills and one has whatever, let's say your protagonist is the martial arts person, then the climax has to hinge on the successful use of the martial arts, not the computer technical skills, not the, overcoming security ops skills, whatever your supporting characters are doing, those need to be in support of the protagonist's face-off with the antagonist. So you have to make sure you construct that climax around your protagonist's specialty.
Yeah, exactly. So to use your example there, if they were trying to get to the main antagonist behind a closed door, the hacker could hack in, get the door open, and the protagonist could then go through and kick the living daylights out of the antagonist and win the day. That would be fine. But if it was the other way around, where the hero was fighting the villain and starting to lose, and then the hacker managed to hack in and close the door and seal them into a vault, seal the villain into the vault and leave the hero free, that wouldn't work.
Right.
If that was the ending, it wouldn't work anyway.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you've got, multiple protagonists where it's, say, 3 equal partners, then you've got to figure out that climax in such a way that all is equally distributed, or, whatever you've got set up, but that agency is key, so that it's choices and stakes driving that action.
Yeah, or you could just be George and kill off your main protagonist and start again.
Yeah, you could do that.
See, gotcha. Yeah, that's an outlier, though, isn't it? I mean, we're talking about pretty much foundational story expectations. And in the Western world, we have an expectation that the hero at some point will have agency, and that's the point of reading the story.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I mean, why else would you read a story if not to engage and live vicariously through the protagonist?
Right.
Yeah, and I guess even if they fail, I mean, it doesn't mean that they save the day. I mean, sometimes, we can have tragic story, but a tragic story where it's just stuff that happens to the hero all the way through and they never do anything.
Right.
Okay, next.
Right. Yes, you can have a tragedy, but you still need agency.
Exactly.
Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.